Hello, my name is Monica Brown, and I teach 8th grade U.S. History and Social Studies at Key Middle School. Today we're going to talk about the ESP causes of the American Revolution. More specifically, we're going to look at the cause of the American Revolution, one of them being the French and Indian War. But before we get started, there are a couple of things that you are going to need for today's lesson. You will need to have a pen or a pencil, and you will need to have paper to complete your assignment. If you have a journal that you prefer to work out of, you most certainly can use your journal. So let's take a look at our learning targets for today. The first thing that you will be able to do is analyze the causes of the American Revolution, including the Proclamation of 1763, the Intolerable Acts, the Stamp Act, mercantilism, lack of representation in Parliament, and British economic policies following the French and Indian War. The second thing you'll be able to do is explain the roles played by significant individuals during the American Revolution, including Samuel Adams, King George III, and George Washington. So your question for today's assignment is, how do the events leading to the American Revolution represent the growing discontent of the American colonists? Notice that I have highlighted the word discontent. Discontent meaning that, how were they unhappy? At first the colonists got to the New World and they were pretty happy, even though it was a struggle many times. They knew why they were leaving England. So now we need to figure out what happened. What were the events that led to the American Revolution? And again, represent the growing discontent among the American colonists. So let's make a real life connection before we even get started. This might help you to understand what was going on with the colonists if you can relate to it yourself. So here's an example. You have a parent that for years has let their kids do pretty much whatever they wanted. They could stay out late, go to parties. They had a lot of freedom. The kids think that this is fair because, they've always worked hard to please their parent. Then suddenly, the parents become very strict and demanding of the kids. They give a curfew, they stop allowing them to hang out with their friends, and they cut their allowance? How do you think the kids might react to their parents' new strictness and discipline? Now let's think about this. Your parent, who has been completely open to you doing pretty much whatever you want to do, let you go out, you hang out with whoever you want, even gave you an allowance, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, says, this will stop. You can't have it anymore. No more hanging out with your friends, no more staying out, no more parties, and absolutely no more allowance. How do you think the kids will react? How do you think you would react if your parents did this? I've provided a sentence stem for you to fill in. I'm going to give you a moment to think about it. I think the kids will, if you can fill in that blank, because. Take a moment to think about that. So if you said something like, I think the kids will be mad because the parent has changed the rules, or if you said something like, the kids would be angry because the parent is not being fair since the kids work so hard and the kids won't listen to the new rules. Did you come up with something similar to that? Well, if you did, then you have an idea about how the colonists were feeling at this time. This is a lot like how the colonists felt following the French and Indian War. We can compare England. Remember, England is the mother country. We can also refer to England as the parent that used to let the colonies do pretty much whatever they wanted. And then all of a sudden, they changed the rules and became very strict. Now we're going to look at the 5 W questions. We're going to read a short text about the French and Indian War. The war strengthened the colonists' growing discontent of England. As we read, we will look for information that would help us answer the 5W question. Britain and France fought 4 wars against each other during the 1600s and 1700s. The last of these, the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, was the only one in which major fighting took place in America as well as Europe. The French and Indian War began in 1754 when both Britain and France claimed the Ohio River Valley. The French built forts in the region to protect their fur trade. British settlers wanted the rich farmlands in the Ohio River Valley. Fighting broke out when a group of Virginia soldiers, under the command of a young colonist by the name of George Washington, encountered a group of French soldiers in what the Virginians considered their western lands. Britain and France sent soldiers from Europe to North America to defend their colonies. Both sides also had the help of different Native American tribes. The Iroquois helped the British, and the Algonquins sided with the French. British colonists also fought in units known as colonial militia. These were part-time soldiers who fight during emergencies. During the first years of the war, most victories belonged to the French, who were more experienced in fighting in the wilderness. Eventually, however, the stronger and more numerous British forces turned the tide of war in their favor. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris brought an official end to the French and Indian War. Americans were thrilled with the victory, and the future for the colonists seemed bright. However, a major storm was about to begin. So now that we have read our story, let's look at the 5W questions. We're going to go back through the text and we're going to look for who, what, when, where, and why. So let's take a look at this first question of who. Who was involved in the war? And where did the war take place? So let's go back through our text and see if we can find out the who and the where. So here we have that first part of our reading. Who was fighting in the war? Well, looks like we have Britain and France. And where, I have highlighted in green, looks like major fighting took place in America as well as Europe. Now let's answer the next 2W questions. When did the war occur, and why were they fighting? So here I have highlighted for you, when did it happen? Well, the French and Indian War began in 1754. And the why? Well, let's look here. Fighting broke out when a group of Virginia soldiers, I highlighted that part first. And then at the bottom, we see that encountered a group of French soldiers in what the Virginians considered their western lands. So we can see the why. And then what caused the war to end? Well, it looks like during the first years of the war, most victories belonged to the French, who were more experienced in fighting in the wilderness. Eventually, however, the stronger and more numerous British forces turned the tide of war in their favor. But here's the big one of the what. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris brought an official end to the French and Indian War. So now we know about the basics of the French and Indian War. Let's explore the economic, social, and political impacts of it. So let's look at the ESP impacts of the French and Indian War. Based on the results of the French and Indian War, I want you to make a prediction about what you think will happen next between the colonists and England. So I've provided for you a graphic organizer. Let's go through this part of the graphic organizer together, and then I want you to take a few moments to complete the graphic organizer by yourself. After you have completed it by yourself, We will go through it together and see if our answers compare. So here is a result. Colonial militia leaders, as well as American commanders like George Washington, gained valuable experience in the field, which would be helpful soon. Tell me, is that an E, S, or P? And remember, E is for economic, S is for social, and P is for political. Let's look at the second one. The victorious British gained control of all French territory on the mainland of North America east of the Mississippi River. Is that an E, S, or P? Third one. Many colonial militiamen expected to be paid with the lands of the Ohio River Valley for their years of fighting. King George III of Britain, however, forbade colonists to move west of the Appalachian Mountains under the proclamation of 1763. Is this issue an E, an S, or a P? Let's look at the fourth one. Colonists were outraged by the proclamation of 1763, feeling that they had been cheated of their part in securing the victory against the French. Many ignored the proclamation of 1763 and moved west anyway. Is that an economic issue, a social issue, or a political issue? And let's look at the last one. After the war, England was in debt. Parliament decided they needed to increase taxes on the colonists to help pay for the expenses of the war. Colonists such as Samuel Adams protected the taxes, crying, "No taxation without representation." Is that an E, an S, or a P issue? Now I'm going to give you a moment to look at the graphic organizer by yourself. Take a few moments to complete it, and then we will complete it together. All right, so now that you've had a chance to do this by yourself, let's compare notes. Let's look at least the first three. So let's look at that first one. Colonial militia leaders, as well as American commanders like George Washington, gained valuable experience in the field, which would be helpful soon. What kind of issue is that? Is it an economic, a political, or a social issue? Well, if you chose a political issue, you are correct. It is a political issue. Let's look at this second one. The victorious British gained control of all French territory on the mainland of North America east of the Mississippi River. Is this an E, S, or P issue? Now, it can be more than one. And in this case, I chose it to be two. So it looks like it's a political issue as well as it being an economic issue. Let's look at the third one. Many colonial militiamen expected to be paid with the lands of the Ohio River Valley for their years of fighting. King George III of Britain, however, forbade colonists to move west of the Appalachian Mountains under the proclamation of 1763. Is this an E, S, or P issue? I think it is a political issue, so I chose P. And if you chose that, then it looks like we are on the same page. And then finally, let's look at this one. The colonists were outraged by the proclamation of 1763, feeling that they had been cheated of their part of securing their victory against the French. Many ignored the proclamation of 1763 and moved west anyway. So we're talking about people packing up and moving. Is this an E, S, or P issue? If you chose a social issue, because we are talking about people making a decision to have a better life, to move from where they were, then you are correct. Now you're going to exercise your writing skills, And you're going to write a letter to a loved one from the point of view of a colonial militiaman. In your letter, this is what we're going to consider. The year is 1763, and you are a colonial militiaman that fought in the French and Indian War on behalf of the British. The war is finally over and you expect to be paid for your service. However, you soon start hearing rumors that that may not happen. On top of that, there is word that the English government is going to raise taxes to pay for the war debt. How do you feel? What are you going to do? Write a letter to a loved one explaining your feelings as a colonist about the results of the French and Indian War. Use information from the completed graphic organizer to guide your writing. Take a moment to look at what you're supposed to do here, and then we're going to show you what your must-haves are. All right, so I've provided a word bank for you to use in your letter. I have provided sentence stems for you to use in your letter. And here's a list of must-haves, okay? So this is what you must have in your letter. It must be written from the point of view of a colonial militiaman. You must explain at least 2 results of the French and Indian War and how they affect you. Give me a statement of what you think the colonists should do next. It must be historically accurate, use information from today's lesson, and you must have complete sentences, use proper spelling, and use proper grammar. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this lesson gave you a pretty good idea of what the colonists were going through at that time. We covered quite a bit today, but I hope that you walked away understanding what the French and Indian War were about and how things began to change in the 13 colonies. I'm Monica Brown, and I teach 8th grade history and social studies at Key Middle School. Thank you. Thank you.